Lately, the more reach we get here at the TAC, the more we hear from even some longtime supporters that we should soften our message to make it more palatable for the general public. I've been told we're too extreme. I guess that was okay until they wanted us to be mainstream. So let me clear this up. The 10th Amendment Center is not a political party, and I'm not personally running for political office. In fact, the only voting I've ever done is with my feet and my dollars. So while we believe in smart strategy to get the word out, we're not politicians, and we never will be. Meaning we're not just going to pretend to be something we're not in order to be more acceptable to the general public. What we believe in is doing what we believe in, whether our views are popular or not. For us, the tool is decentralization under the 10th Amendment, and the goal is liberty. Gresham's law says that bad money drives out good, but with current efforts to support gold and silver, things could go the other way. Over the last few years, several states including Arizona, Wyoming, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Alabama have repealed taxes on the sale or exchange of gold and silver. Repealing these taxes lowers the overall cost of using gold and silver for everyday transactions. If people in large numbers start using these metals as money, it's likely to crowd out worthless Federal Reserve fiat notes and effectively nullify the Fed's unconstitutional monopoly on money. But some people tell us this could never happen because of a principle known as Gresham's law, which states that bad money drives out good. For example, when the US government replaced silver quarters and dimes with coins made primarily of less valuable copper, the cheap coins drove the silver out of circulation. People hoarded the more valuable silver coins and spent the less valuable copper money. But constitutional tender expert Bill Green believes it will be the opposite in practice today. In a paper for the Mises Institute, he wrote if people start using sound money, the fact that the coins hold their value more than Federal Reserve notes will lead to what he calls a reverse Gresham's law effect, where good money, gold and silver coins, will drive out the bad money, that is, Federal Reserve fiat notes. The key for this is in making it easier to use gold and silver in everyday transactions. The reason bad money drives out good is because governments put up barriers to using sound money in day-to-day life. That makes it more costly to spend gold and silver and actually incentivizes the hoarding. When you take down those barriers, you level the playing field and you allow gold and silver to compete head-to-head with Federal Reserve notes. On an even playing field, gold and silver wins. Expanding the ability for people to freely choose gold and silver as money is how we define getting the job done. In the long run, whether this actually helps end the Federal Reserve monetary monopoly is, of course, something that can only be shown to happen or not over time. Ultimately, it's up to personal choice and human action.
Virtually any mainstream article that you read about state sovereignty or nullification is going to include a quote from a legal scholar. Now, 9 times out of 10, this lawyer or law professor is going to cite the Supremacy Clause. It's like federal supremacists think the Supremacy Clause is some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. They slap it down, and instantly any state action is invalidated. The Washington Examiner recently ran a fantastic article. It was headlined, "On the 5th Anniversary of Snowden Leak, One State Effectively Bans the NSA." The article featured a law recently passed in Michigan that bans all state support and cooperation with warrantless surveillance. Lo and behold, our legal scholar made an appearance, this time in the form of a Brookings Institute fellow who happened to also be a former NSA lawyer named Susan Hennessy. And yes, she predictably trotted out the Supremacy Clause, saying that it could spell trouble for the Michigan law. This is bovine scat. The Supreme Court has consistently held since 1842 that the federal government cannot force a state to use its personnel or resources to enforce a federal law or implement a federal program. In fact, this anti-commandeering doctrine was a key part of a recent Supreme Court ruling that overturned a federal sports betting law. So no, the Michigan law does not have any Supremacy Clause issues. The federal government cannot force Michigan to cooperate with warrantless surveillance. Hennessy is either a really, really bad lawyer or she's lying.
Running to federal courts can often make things even worse. National organizations like the ACLU and the NRA put a lot of time and energy into fighting things they oppose in federal court. But this approach only guarantees that bad decisions are going to be bad for everyone. Here's an example. The Supreme Court recently ruled in favor of an Arizona cop who shot a woman outside her Tucson home. The Supreme Court reversed an appellate court opinion and ruled that the officer was entitled to qualified immunity. This effectively shields government officials from lawsuits over violations of rights. The majority held that there was no clear precedent that would have alerted the officer that opening fire in this situation amounted to unconstitutionally excessive force. Now, even without getting into all the details of this particular case, it's clear the ruling is convoluted and pretty much creates a get-out-of-jail-free card for cops everywhere. Responding to it in a tweet, the ACLU said, "SCOTUS continues to make it nearly impossible to hold police officers accountable." But the real problem is running to a federal court to address a local issue in the first place. It could have been handled in the state court system under the state constitution. Now granted, the Arizona court system might have come up with the same bad decision, but that opinion then would only have applied in Arizona. By making a federal case out of it, we now have a horrible precedent that applies to everyone in the entire country. Keeping state and local violations of rights as state or local issues, even in court, ensures that bad outcomes are limited geographically and the right outcome still has a chance in other states. The founders knew that one-size-fits-all solutions were dangerous for liberty. That's why they included the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights. Did you know that before Daniel Webster was against nullification, he was for it? Webster was an ardent nationalist and known for his opposition to nullification. In fact, he famously debated John C. Calhoun on the subject. But like many politicians today, his tune was far different a few years earlier. Webster called on states to resist federal conscription of soldiers during the War of 1812. The war and the attempt to institute a national draft were extremely unpopular in the Northeast, so much so that many Federalists who expressed fierce opposition to the whole concept of nullification back in 1798 suddenly became strong supporters. Webster called the proposed draft inconsistent with the character of a free government and emphasized it was not authorized by the Constitution. Webster then urged states to take actions that he considered both constitutional and legal. He said, it will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between their citizens and arbitrary power. These are among the objects for which the state governments exist. Whatever Daniel Webster might have said about nullification later in his life, he was dead right in 1812. Supporting and using sound money doesn't mean you need to carry around a bunch of coins in your pocket. Whenever we talk about sound money and using gold and silver for everyday transactions, some people mock the idea with jokes about having to cut coins into little slivers just to make change. But with the advent of secure electronic payment systems, you don't even need to carry gold or silver coins in your pocket. You can buy and sell using sound money with the swipe of a card. This may soon be a reality in Texas. With the creation of the Texas Bullion Depository, people will be able to deposit gold and silver at the facility and then initiate electronic transactions using their stored metal. Basically, this is going to be just like using your bank debit card, except instead of moving dollars from one account to another, you'll be moving gold and silver. And this is already happening in places like Utah. A private company called United Precious Metals Association, or UPMA, offers publicly available accounts denominated in gold and silver dollars, backed by the physical metal. Gold money offers similar services nationwide. So the technology is already in place for the widespread use of sound money. States like Texas, Utah, and Arizona have passed legislation to create a legal environment favorable to the use of sound money. If people start using sound money over time, it's likely to crowd out worthless Federal Reserve fiat notes and effectively nullify the Fed's unconstitutional monopoly on money. The real barrier to using gold and silver in everyday transactions isn't the need to cut up coins or carry around bags of gold or silver. The real barrier is a mindset that only embraces the status quo. General warrants, the ability to search your stuff for any reason, was a big reason for the American Revolution. Prior to the Revolution, British courts issued general warrants called writs of assistance. These allowed government officials to enter any private home or business at their whim to conduct a search. General warrants never expired, and they could even be transferred to another agent. A person holding a general warrant could never be held responsible for damage they did to somebody's property. Basically, a government officer with a general warrant was above the law. Writs of assistance were a flashpoint in the years leading up to the Revolution. James Otis argued strongly against their constitutionality in what came to be known as Paxton's case. He didn't win that case, but his fiery speech heavily influenced John Adams and other revolutionary leaders. Otis vividly described the impact of the writs. He said, "Now one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege." In many ways, we've come full circle today. The NSA uses secret court orders to snoop into our electronic data with almost no limitations. They don't require probable cause of a crime, and they don't have to say what they're looking for. General warrants were unreasonable, unjust, and unconstitutional in the revolutionary times, and they still are today. Whenever you give government power to do something you like, you're also giving your opponents the power to do the opposite. Sometimes people tell us we are missing opportunities to expand liberty by insisting on decentralization of power and refusing to turn to Washington, D.C. for solutions. They tell us that sometimes we need federal power to keep states from violating our rights. For instance, a lot of conservatives have put their faith in federal courts to protect their gun rights from strict state regulations. Others will point to successes, such as the Supreme Court decision that struck down Virginia's ban on interracial marriages. Every once in a while, the feds do get something right, and we do see a small victory for liberty. As the saying goes, it's basically a broken clock. But the strategy of giving the federal government more power in the hopes that it will use it to protect your rights comes with great danger. The power you give it today can be used against you tomorrow. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that they will be able to control federal power by putting good guys in charge. Even though that never seems to happen, that might work for a while in theory, but at some point the other people are going to take control anyway. Former Libertarian Party presidential candidate Harry Browne summed it up perfectly. Give good people the power to do good, and that power eventually will be in the hands of bad people to do bad. More power centralized in Washington, D.C. is always the problem. It's never the solution, at least not in the long run. Resist much, obey little. Around 1860, Walt Whitman penned a poem originally entitled Walt Whitman's Caution. The poem was later retitled as a message to the states. Both titles are appropriate. The poem is a cautionary tale for states and cities too. In a few perfectly chosen words, Whitman captured the danger of unquestioning obedience to the central authority. He wrote, "To the states, or any one of them, or any city of the states, resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty." Walt Whitman was right. We need less unquestioning obedience and more refusal to cooperate. Some people believe that we can't use sound money because there's supposedly not enough gold. But they couldn't be more wrong. Claims that gold can't be used as money because there's not enough of it reveal a fundamental misunderstanding. There's always enough metal to support the money supply. It's just a question of price. While it would be impossible to support the economy at the current price per ounce, the market would simply reprice the metal higher to make the system workable. Some people estimate a gold price between $9,000 and $10,000 per ounce would do the trick for a worldwide gold standard. This might sound like a lot, but you have to remember that gold is divisible. You can split gold to fractions of an ounce for transactions. As the dollar price per ounce rises, people use smaller and smaller fractions for everyday transactions. More importantly, the finite amount of gold isn't a flaw. It's a feature. It's what makes it ideal for backing a monetary system. The limited amount of metal keeps governments from artificially inflating the money supply and stealing your wealth. There is no way to turn on a printing press and create gold and silver out of thin air. That's why central planners hate sound money. They can't easily manipulate the system. So, contrary to the claim that gold and silver can't be used as money because there's a limited supply, it's actually the opposite. It's the ideal basis for a monetary system because it's finite and divisible. Taking away rights because some people abuse them is dangerous. Every time someone uses a gun to commit a crime, You'll hear gun control supporters claim that new restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms are necessary. They don't care that criminals don't follow the law, and they don't care that they'll be attacking an essential tool of self-defense. Their view is extremely dangerous. But they're not alone. Lately, a small but very vocal minority of conservatives have been complaining in much the same way about nullification. They tell us that nullification is bad because, as they say it, sanctuary cities are nullification. Their view is also very dangerous. These conservatives, like Michael Bloomberg and other gun control supporters, oppose everyone using their rights because they oppose how some people use them. And make no mistake about it, you have a right to nullify as much as you have a right to free speech, to privacy, or to keep and bear arms. James Madison put it this way: the nullification meant by Mr. Jefferson is the natural right, which all admit to be a remedy against insupportable oppression. Can the federal government just withhold all money to get state and local governments to do things? The short answer is no. The Supreme Court has long held that the feds cannot force or coerce states to use their personnel or resources to enforce federal laws or implement federal programs. This includes using federal funding as a coercive stick. But some people claim the National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984 is proof the feds can withhold any funds they want if states don't do what the federal government wants them to do. In fact, that law did allow the feds to take away a maximum of 10% of highway funds from states that didn't raise the drinking age to 21. That law was challenged, and the Supreme Court held that withholding the funds was okay, but only because it was a small percentage of total funding. The court specifically said in its opinion the amount of funding withheld cannot be coercive. It was on this basis that the court overturned requirements to expand Medicaid in Obamacare. In his opinion in Independent Business versus Sebelius, Justice Roberts held that the federal government couldn't compel states to expand Medicaid by threatening to withhold funding for Medicaid programs already in place, calling it coercive and a violation of the separation of powers. Now keep in mind that most federal funding programs are unconstitutional in the first place. But on top of it, even the Supreme Court has repeatedly held the line that the feds simply aren't able to use all federal funding as a way to get the states to do whatever they want. What can gun rights supporters learn from immigration sanctuary cities? Quite a lot. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has just over 5,700 enforcement and removal agents, that's ERO agents, nationwide. And with that workforce size, they have a capacity of roughly 250,000 deportations for a year. Interestingly enough, the ATF has even fewer employees, just over 5,000, and about a third of them are in administration. That labor force gives them a capacity of a little over 8,000 closed cases per year. I often hear people talk about how sanctuary cities are nullifying federal immigration law, and the federal government should force them to submit in some way. But you know what I never hear? Something like this. Those 300 gun sanctuaries need to enforce federal gun laws, or they should lose their federal funding. You know why? Such a thing doesn't exist. There is a small handful of counties and towns with a policy that we could call sanctuary, banning the use of local resources for the enforcement of federal gun control measures. But the number is extremely small, less than 10, and that's something that should absolutely change. As James Madison put it in Federalist number 46, states and individuals should utilize a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union to bring down federal programs. Think of it this way. If there were 10 or 11 million undocumented short-barreled shotguns in violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934, there is absolutely no way the federal government would have the resources or manpower to stop them without local enforcement of federal law. Some people want you to believe that right to try acts don't do anything, but people in Texas have already proved them wrong. Under the expanded access provision of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, patients with serious or immediately life-threatening diseases may access some experimental drugs after receiving express FDA approval. The process is slow, and many people never get approved. State right-to-try acts, like one passed in Texas, bypass this federal process and allow some patients to try treatments without first getting FDA approval. Some FDA supporters claim these state laws do nothing, but they couldn't be more wrong. In 2010, Houston-based oncologist Dr. Ibrahim Deplasand got FDA approval to conduct a 5-year clinical trial for a treatment he developed for the form of cancer that took the life of Steve Jobs. After completing the final trial phase in March 2015, he requested an extension because the FDA had not given final approval for the drug, even though it was under widespread use in Europe for more than 15 years. The FDA told him to immediately stop treating patients. But when the Texas Right to Try Act went into effect, he resumed treating his patients under the new state law. To date, the doctor has treated at least 78 patients. He put it this way: many of these patients were only given 3 to 6 months to live. Now, a year later, many of them are still alive. While the FDA would have let all these people die, the Texas Right to Try Act, along with the heroic actions of Dr. Deplasand, has given them hope. The path to liberty begins with a single step. The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu was right. To accomplish a huge goal takes many small steps. Working for liberty is the same. It takes a whole lot of small steps to bring about meaningful change. But a lot of libertarians have no patience for a step-by-step strategy. They'll settle for nothing short of complete victory on the first try, even though this almost never happens. As a result, a lot of these same people quickly get discouraged and quit. But the struggle for liberty is a long uphill battle, so strategy is essential. Here's how Mr. Libertarian Murray Rothbard put it. For the libertarian, the main task of the present epoch is to cast off his needless and debilitating pessimism, to set his sights on long-run victory, and to set about the road to its attainment. But still, some people resist supporting any action that doesn't go all the way. In fact, they'll even attack our work as a compromise. But again, Rothbard understood that when it comes to politics and liberty, we have to be practical. He said, "Libertarians must come to realize that parroting ultimate principles is not enough for coping with the real world." This all fits right in with our motto, a Latin phrase from founding father John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. He wrote, "Concordia res parve crescunt," which means small things grow great by concord. For long-run victory, we always have our sights set on the ultimate goal. But strategically, we know that victory for liberty will come one small step at a time. Did you know the federal government works with local police to create a huge loophole in any state restrictions on asset forfeiture? Understanding what's happening is the first step to ending it. Here's how it works. Let's say police pull over a car and find $10,000 cash. They don't find drugs, but suspect it's drug-related, so they take it. If state law is good on forfeiture, police can't keep the money without an actual conviction. So instead, what they do is simply claim the case is a federal issue, allowing them to hand it off to a federal agency. This opens the door to a program known as the Federal Equitable Sharing Program, and the police then get to keep as much as 80% of the forfeiture, with only about 20% going to the federal agency. While calls to reform forfeiture bring important attention to legalized government theft, they'll have no long-term real effect unless this massive federal loophole is closed by each state. States do have the ability to impact the federal government's refugee resettlement program. As was widely reported last week, Texas Governor Greg Abbott has officially told the National Office of Refugee Resettlement that if certain conditions aren't met, the state will be withdrawing from the federal resettlement program. Of course, the New York Times quickly downplayed the impact of Texas withdrawing from the program, but the practical realities look different. The state provides vital logistical, medical, and social service assistance. Texas manages $96 million in federal funds for services provided to refugees, and last year alone, it resettled some 7,000 refugees. Several nonprofits, such as the International Rescue Committee and a handful of faith-affiliated agencies, assist the state in its efforts. But if Texas pulls out, private agencies will have to carry the full load. Quite a tall order in such a large state. In other words, the federal government depends on significant state action to resettle refugees. Without state administration of the federal program, it will become much more difficult to successfully resettle refugees. Even Ian Millhiser of the rabidly pro-federal Think Progress agrees. He said such policies would potentially make settlement of refugees more difficult than it would be if the states cooperated. The bottom line is this: while resettlement is a federal policy, the feds generally depend on the states to implement it. Lack of assistance by Texas will almost certainly reduce resettlement in that state. And if other states follow suit, it will be extremely difficult for the federal program to continue as is. Even though leading founders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock famously defied government through direct action, many conservatives today reject anything that includes civil disobedience as part of the strategy. We often hear from people on the right that civil disobedience is a tool of the left, or they need to respect the rule of law. But this not only obliterates the rule of law by making the whims of Congress supreme over the Constitution, it also rejects the advice of James Madison, who recommended states and individuals utilize a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union to stop the federal government. Unfortunately, though, this isn't a new problem. In an 1857 speech, Frederick Douglass, a Republican, took this mentality to task. He said, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters." Here's the short version. If you believe in liberty, sitting on the sidelines is simply not an option. Some people want you to think that the solution to problems with police is to get the federal government more involved. But they've got things completely backwards. President Obama has called for federalizing police training and practices through the use of federal lawsuits, grants, and threats to cut federal funding. Al Sharpton has been less subtle. He came right out and said the DOJ should take over policing in this country. But Obama and Sharpton and many others actually got their wish a long time ago. Local police everywhere have been acting as agents of the federal government for decades. It's the feds who are arming local police with military-grade weapons. It's the feds who are pouring billions of dollars into police department budgets to buy surveillance equipment. It's the feds incentivizing local cops to focus on federal policing instead of local policing duties, from the unconstitutional war on drugs to unconstitutional gun control and everything else in between. It is the feds who have turned serve and protect into command and control. More federal dollars and more federal control will only make things worse. So what's the solution? Local police should be local police. They need to stop acting like employees of the federal government and start acting like peace officers in their own communities. While we often get great support from people in the loosely defined liberty movement, there are some who scoff at our strategic plan, claiming we're some kind of statist organization. But a leading ANCAP thinker gave virtually the same strategic advice that we do today. In a 1997 speech, now available as an ebook from the Mises Institute under the title What Must Be Done, Hans Hermann Hoppe gave a plan of action for anarcho-capitalists against the modern state. He said that it is advisable to engage in a policy of passive resistance and non-cooperation. One simply stops to help in the enforcement of each and every federal law. Hoppe also noted how effective this strategy can be, saying, "Without local enforcement by compliant local authorities, the will of the central government is not much more than hot air." What's striking to me is how closely this mirrors the advice of James Madison. In Federalist Paper number 46, he recommended a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union as an effective plan to stopping federal programs. Today, we work to put this advice from Madison, Hoppe, and others into practice against all kinds of unconstitutional federal acts, from marijuana prohibition to gun prohibition and everything in between. As Etienne de la Boétie put it, "Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer." My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. Some people are calling for the federal government to restrict the right to keep and bear arms of people who are on the federal government's terrorism watch list. This is not just totally unconstitutional, but sets an extremely dangerous precedent for all our rights. If the federal government can take away someone else's right to defend himself simply because it has unilaterally decided to place him on a secret, wildly inaccurate list that's virtually impossible to be removed from, eventually some bureaucrat is going to find a way to put you on that list for another reason. The founders, most notably Patrick Henry, were extremely concerned about this kind of power. In a speech during the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he said, "The liberties of a people never were, nor ever will be secure when the transactions of their rulers may be concealed from them." Here's the short version. Whatever power you give politicians and bureaucrats to use against other people will eventually be used by future politicians and bureaucrats against you. Even though the Constitution reserves power for food safety to the states or the people, the FDA wants to enforce universal, one-size-fits-all control over everything you eat and drink. We'll cover 4 ways they do this next. The Wholesome Meat Act of 1967 mandates meat must be slaughtered and processed at a federally approved slaughterhouse. Small slaughterhouses cannot meet the requirements. As a result, the meat processing industry went through massive consolidation. Since the passage of the act, the number of slaughterhouses dropped from more than 10,000 to less than 3,000. Today, instead of hundreds of companies processing meat, 3 corporations control virtually the entire industry. The Food Safety Modernization Act directs FDA to build an integrated national food safety system in partnership with state and local authorities, explicitly recognizing that all food safety agencies need to work in integrated ways to achieve public health goals. Essentially, this means dictating food laws to the states. The 2002 Bioterrorism Act mandated that any facility engaged in manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding food for consumption in the United States be registered with the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. The Food Safety Modernization Act expanded this to include firms exclusively engaged in intrastate commerce. This gives the FDA wide-ranging power to meddle in state food and beverage regulations. The feds also buy compliance with their mandates by bribing state agencies through funding. The FDA Food Code establishes one-size-fits-all regulations for retail food establishments. It supposedly operates as a voluntary program, but according to the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, the FDA makes these food codes effectively mandatory by entering into cooperative agreements with state agencies under a funding opportunity called Advancing Conformance with the Voluntary National Retail Food Regulatory Program Standards. The states don't have to enter into these agreements with the FDA. In fact, state legislatures can prohibit these types of agreements completely. If the states say no and take their own approach, the FDA has almost no power to do anything about it. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. Once completed, the next generation identification database being developed by the FBI and other federal agencies will be one of the largest pools of biometric information in the world. State and local police are a big part of this plan, and we'll talk about that next. This new biometric database will not only contain fingerprints, it will also store millions of facial recognition photographs, voice recognition data, iris scans, and even DNA profiles. Millions of people with no criminal records will end up being tracked and traced in every way imaginable. But the feds won't be able to collect all of this data alone. According to the Electronic Privacy Information Center, state and local law enforcement will do much of the heavy lifting when it comes to data collection. The feds essentially bribe state and local law enforcement to bring them on as partners in this massive data collection operation. The federal government funds the hardware and programs being used and then collects data through information sharing agreements tied into the funding. In fact, manufacturers of equipment used to capture biometric information teach local law enforcement agencies how to access federal cash. Last year, a company called MorphoTrack put together a webinar titled How to Access Federal Funding for Biometric Technology. According to the website biometricupdate.com, the federal government provided over $1 billion for state and local governments to purchase biometric systems and devices in 2014 alone. These programs will continue to grow until people start pressuring their states to flat out refuse to participate. It needs to be stopped before it's too late. How many federal gun control measures are constitutional? 0. And we'll talk about that next. The Second Amendment declares that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The meaning of the word infringe hasn't changed since the Bill of Rights was ratified. It means to act so as to limit or undermine something, encroach on, or violate. The Second Amendment supersedes any conceivable authority to regulate firearms you might be able to wring out of the other delegated powers in the Constitution. Simply put, the federal government may not constitutionally act in any way that limits the right to keep and bear arms. That means all federal gun control measures, all of them, including the acts of 1934 and 1968, are unconstitutional, and they should be treated that way too. Is the NSA constitutional? I'm not talking about its spying programs or even recent reports that it will pass data along to your local police. Today, I'll share with you just how the NSA was created, and you can decide if it should even exist. Unlike the CIA or the National Security Council, which were created by enabling legislation from Congress, for decades, almost no one in the general public even knew the NSA existed. As James Bamford put it in his book, The Puzzle Palace, it was a totally black organization, with only a few people outside the executive branch even aware of it. In fact, the NSA was so secretive that insiders jokingly gave it the name No Such Agency. Bamford also notes that this isn't just some small administrative agency. It's huge. It employed as many as 100,000 people at the height of the Vietnam War, and somewhere around 30,000 people today. So how did this massive secret spy agency come about? On October 24, 1952, President Truman wrote a secret memorandum about intelligence activities and issued what was called National Security Council Intelligence Directive No. 9, Revised. On November 4, 1952, less than 2 weeks after President Truman issued the secret memorandum, the NSA was created by an order of the Secretary of Defense. Since that time, the NSA has created its own view of the Fourth Amendment and imposed it on everyone. Knowing how it was started, what do you think of the NSA? My view is this: under the Constitution, the NSA shouldn't even exist. Did you know that local law enforcement agencies often commit significant resources to helping the federal government enforce federal gun laws and regulations? Coming up next, we'll share with you the official agreement between a local police department in Arizona and the ATF. Government agencies often use what are known as memorandums of agreement to formalize a working relationship. These MOAs are a conditional agreement where a transfer of funds for services are anticipated. Resources for the ATF are nowhere close to what they need to enforce federal gun control, so these agreements are a huge part of their strategy. For example, take this one, which just went into effect last November between the ATF and the Glendale Police Department in Arizona. Here's what Glendale Police promises to provide the ATF. Assigned officers to assist ATF in investigations of federal, state, and local laws. Officers will be assigned on a dedicated rather than a rotational basis. The Glendale Police Department pays for everything in most situations, even if the officers are working for the ATF and not enforcing state or local law. And here's what the ATF promises to provide in return. That's right, absolutely nothing. The MOA only authorizes a reimbursement for overtime salary payments and some pre-approved expenses. Section 5 notes that the Glendale Police Department will cover all other costs of employment, including withholdings and insurance. We've not been able to locate another MOA that authorizes reimbursement for regular salary, so if that's the case, the feds don't reimburse any salaries unless they work overtime. The ATF gets them for free. And even the overtime reimbursement isn't guaranteed. Section 5 makes that quite clear. The ATF is getting the Glendale Police Department in Arizona to do their job for them, and they're getting it done for free on the back of Arizona taxpayers. The agreement is in effect until September 30th, 2020. State-level legislation banning this kind of material support to the ATF could end the agreement. It includes a provision for cancellation with a 60-day notice. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. Last December, we issued a warning about asset forfeiture, that a massive federal loophole would render most state reform efforts worthless. Just weeks later, the Department of Justice suspended the federal program, and many in the grassroots celebrated. But like most positive federal actions, it was short-lived, and this week the DOJ resumed the program. Known as equitable sharing, this federal program allows local police departments to circumvent even the toughest state-level restrictions on asset forfeiture, rendering most attempts at reform completely ineffective in practice. For instance, a bill signed into law in Wyoming this year makes it slightly more difficult for law enforcement to successfully seize assets without a criminal conviction under state law. But the new law failed to address this federal loophole of equitable sharing. Police can now completely avoid the stricter state law by passing cases off to the feds, and they'll enjoy a nice financial windfall in the process. Here in California, this has been a notorious issue. The state has some of the strongest restrictions on the use of asset forfeiture. But there's no restriction on partnering with the feds, so local police have run wild with it, turning more and more cases over to the federal government and getting up to 80% of the proceeds, that's cash, cars, and other property. And that all happens without a criminal conviction. The federal government will never roll back its asset forfeiture program. The path to reform lies through the states. State legislatures must require a criminal conviction before proceeding with forfeiture of property, and they must close this massive federal loophole by banning law enforcement from simply partnering with the federal equitable sharing program as a way to circumvent state law. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. People ask us all the time, why do we need to pass a bill in the states for something that's already in the Constitution? The answer is next. We all know what the Fourth Amendment says. So why would state agents need something else to direct them to do what is already clear from the words "shall not be violated"? Shouldn't they nullify federal actions that infringe on your natural right to privacy simply based on the words of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution? In a perfect world, maybe. But if we lived in a perfect world, we wouldn't be dealing with mass surveillance or so many other constitutional violations in the first place. Sometimes you need something more than the words of the Constitution, an extra strategic move from the state level to make it difficult or impossible for the feds to continue violating your rights. In fact, this is pretty much what the father of the Constitution recommended for how to deal with federal overreach. In Federalist Paper number 46, James Madison gave us a blueprint of sorts to stop federal programs without going to the federal government. He recommended that states use what he called legislative devices to counter federal programs. And he also recommended a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. For example, a Fourth Amendment Protection Act that bans a state from providing material support or resources to federal warrantless surveillance programs is simply putting James Madison's advice into practice today. And what's the number one indicator that this would work? Other than the fact that agents representing local spy programs are the ones to most aggressively lobby against such bills, Ian Millhiser of the rabid, progressive, nationalist Think Progress has warned people on the left against using this very tactic. Why? Well, he's worried that it could work so well that people might start using it against federal programs he wants to keep. And because that's probably most of them, this should be a green light to use this strategy all the time. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. The media loves to trot out college professors as a way to shoot down every attempt to resist federal power. They're cited as experts, and they almost always favor more federal power. Today, we're going to cover a common example which shows they often don't have a clue what they're talking about. A South Carolina TV station recently did a story on several bills filed in that state to ban the use of state personnel or resources to enforce federal gun control measures. As we've covered here previously, this is a very effective way to bring down federal gun control because the federal government doesn't have the resources to go it alone. The reporter quoted a local politics professor from Coastal Carolina University. Frederick Wood claimed the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution made the bills unconstitutional. Clearly, this guy doesn't understand what the words "in pursuance" mean in the Supremacy Clause. But that's not even the point. The Supremacy Clause only becomes part of the discussion when state and federal law actively conflict. For example, if South Carolina were attempting to regulate commerce across state lines, then one could make an argument that the Constitution delegates the power to regulate interstate commerce to the federal government. But these bills are doing no such thing. They're not attempting to overturn a federal law. They're not even attempting to assert authority over anything the feds are trying to do themselves. They're simply using smart strategy and exposing an Achilles heel. That is, the feds don't have the resources to enforce their own gun control without help from the states. Even the Supreme Court has repeatedly sanctioned this hands-off approach in 4 major opinions over 170 years. The so-called anti-commandeering doctrine simply says that states don't have to help the federal government enforce its laws or regulatory programs. You'd think that a constitutional expert for the local news would know at least these basics. But by shooting his mouth off about the Supremacy Clause, Frederick Wood showed us that he either didn't even read the bills or he doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. Between you and me, it's probably both. Either way, like many other professors, he's unqualified to be cited as an expert on the Constitution. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you for watching. Some people want you to believe that Supreme Court opinions are the final word on the constitutionality of anything and everything, but they couldn't be more wrong. Political and legal commentators like to tell us that under the Constitution, the Supreme Court is the last resort, the final arbiter of what is and isn't constitutional. In short, they pretty much take the position that these 9 unelected, unaccountable, politically connected lawyers are virtually infallible. James Madison, however, disagreed. Regarding who has the final word, the father of the Constitution wrote this in his famous Report of 1800. However true, therefore, it may be that the judicial department is, in all questions submitted to it by the forms of the Constitution, to decide in the last resort, this resort must necessarily be deemed the last in relation to the authorities of the other departments of the government, not in relation to the rights of the parties to the constitutional compact from which the judicial as well as the other departments hold their delegated trusts. As Tom Woods has noted, the parties to the constitutional compact are the people of the states. In other words, the created cannot be greater than the creator. And because the federal government, including the federal courts, are a creature of the people of the several states, its opinion can never be the final word on what is constitutional or not. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. The feds believe they have the power to ban raw milk sales and consumption in the entire country. But state and local resistance can bring this federal prohibition scheme to an end. It is the FDA's position that raw milk should never be consumed. A 1987 federal law banned the interstate commerce of raw milk. But that isn't the end of what the feds want to do. They also claim the authority to ban raw milk that has never even crossed state lines. Insiders say it's only a matter of time before they try to institute this kind of nationwide ban. Armed raids by FDA agents on companies like Rawsome Foods back in 2011 and Amish Farms over the last few years also indicate this scenario may not be too far off. But state bills to legalize raw milk can help end this federal prohibition scheme before it ever gets off the ground. As we've seen with marijuana, a federal ban becomes pretty ineffective as more states ignore it. The federal government lacks the enforcement power necessary to maintain its ban, and people are more likely to take on the small risk of federal sanctions if they know the state will not interfere. In the same way, removing state barriers to raw milk consumption, sale, and production can nullify a federal ban in practice as well. If all 50 states allow raw milk, markets within the states could easily grow to the point that local sales would render the federal ban on interstate and intrastate commerce pointless. And history indicates the feds do not have the resources to stop people from transporting milk across state lines either, especially if multiple states start legalizing it. Bottom line, if enough people say no to a federal ban on raw milk and enough states pass laws backing those people up, there's not much the feds can do to shove their unconstitutional plans down our throats. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. When people tell you that mass warrantless surveillance from the NSA or any other agency is constitutional, they're either ignorant or they're lying. In the colonial era, British courts issued what were known as general writs of assistance as a way to supposedly crack down on smuggling. They allowed government officials to enter any private home or business and search for evidence. These writs basically authorized searches anywhere, anytime, for anything the government wanted. American colonists rightly despised them. James Otis vividly described the feeling colonial Americans held towards them. He said, "Now one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege." The Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights grew out of this experience and absolutely prohibits broad, sweeping, arbitrary searches and seizures. It requires federal agents, requires them to get a warrant, including specific descriptions of the place they intend to search and exactly what they are looking for. While technology has changed since revolutionary times, modern federal spy agencies like the NSA operate exactly the same way as the hated British customs agents. They claim broad and arbitrary authority to search and seize whatever they want, and they do so with impunity. When the NSA and other federal agencies snoop through your phone calls, your browsing history, and other private information, they are every bit as offensive as it would be if they marched into your home and grab the papers off your desk. And whether the spying is done in the name of security or anything else, if they're not getting warrants based on probable cause, they're violating the Fourth Amendment. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. When enough people decide they just aren't going to follow a federal law, there really isn't a whole lot the government can do about it. And that's exactly what's happening when it comes to federal marijuana prohibition. A couple weeks ago, the state of Oregon began accepting applications from people wanting to open retail marijuana businesses. On the first day alone, the state received 142 applications. Officials said they expected around 800 people to apply for licenses before the deadline. Now keep in mind, every one of these budding entrepreneurs and all of their potential customers, all of them, will be breaking federal law. Why are so many people willing to start up a business in direct violation of federal drug law? Well, two reasons. First, there's a strong market demand. And second, because Oregon opened the door with the state law supporting these efforts. Last October, medical marijuana facilities in Oregon were allowed to begin selling to recreational users. In the first week alone, dispensaries in Oregon sold a staggering $11 million of weed. That's a lot of people consuming a lot of marijuana. Or to put it another way, that's a lot of people breaking federal law. Everyone knows there really isn't a thing the feds can do about it. And the fact of the matter is that more than 90% of marijuana arrests happened at the state or local level. When Oregon legalized recreational marijuana, it removed an entire layer of laws prohibiting it. With the threat of state punishment gone, people were more than willing to risk the minuscule chance the feds might try to enforce their own laws. So while the feds continue to claim that cannabis is illegal, hundreds of people are willing to open marijuana-related businesses in Oregon anyway. Thousands of people won't hesitate to walk through their doors and plunk down their hard-earned cash to buy this product. By legalizing marijuana for the general public, Oregon set the stage for businesses and everyday people to nullify federal prohibition in practice within the state. My name is Michael Bolden, reporting for the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching. Liberty depends on courageous people willing to sacrifice. Today, you'll learn the story of a hero, Passmore Williamson. Passmore Williamson was a radical abolitionist and a member of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society during a time when opposing slavery was neither common nor generally popular. In the summer of 1855, John Wheeler stopped in Philadelphia with his slave Jane Johnson and her two boys. At the docks, Johnson asked a black porter for help in gaining freedom, and he contacted William Still, chairman of the Abolition Society's Vigilance Committee. Still and Passmore raced to the dock where Wheeler was boarding a steamboat to New York. Passmore told Johnson that under Pennsylvania law, she was free if she wanted to be. Johnson and her two sons voluntarily left with Still. Some deckhands even restrained Wheeler when he tried to stop her. A federal district judge charged Passmore with contempt of court when he wouldn't reveal Johnson's location. But Williamson couldn't tell even if he wanted to, because William Still never said where he took her. Passmore served 100 days in prison, but this generated nationwide attention, advancing the abolitionist cause. Meanwhile, Still and 5 deckhands were tried for forcible abduction, riot, and assault. Johnson, who was living free in New York at the time, came back to Philadelphia, entering the courtroom hidden by a veil. She testified that she was not abducted, refuting the prosecution and gaining acquittal for Still and 3 men. 2 others got reduced charges. After the trial, state and local officials ushered Johnson out of town, helping her elude federal marshals attempting to capture her under the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. She lived out the rest of her life as a free woman. Passmore Williamson, William Still, dock hands, state and local officials, and countless others defied federal power and risked their own freedom for the freedom of a woman and her boys. A woman who was herself willing to risk her own newly won freedom for others in return. This is the kind of courage that liberty is made of. This is the kind of courage that liberty needs today. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison first formalized the principles of nullification in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. In response to the hated Alien and Sedition Acts, which were put into law by the John Adams administration, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison secretly authored resolutions for Kentucky and Virginia declaring the federal acts to be a usurpation of powers never delegated to the federal government in the Constitution. While non-binding, they put in writing the foundational principles of nullification. That is, if the federal government has the exclusive right to judge the extent of its own powers, those powers will always grow, regardless of elections, lawsuits, protests, or other so-called checks and balances. In short, both Jefferson and Madison expected the states to take steps to bring down such federal acts without waiting for the federal courts to refer to them as unconstitutional. Jefferson began the Kentucky resolutions with a powerful statement about the role of the states. The several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. Here, Jefferson was telling us that when the federal government violates our rights, we're not just supposed to sit idly by and wait for the federal government to stop itself. He continued, noting that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. In his original draft, Jefferson said that in response to such federal acts, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. This language was included in follow-up resolutions passed by Kentucky in 1799. Resolutions passed by Virginia just before Christmas in 1798 used very similar language. Authored by James Madison, they note that in response to federal acts outside the Constitution, the states are duty-bound to interpose in order to maintain within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which came to be known as the Principles of '98, didn't explain how to actually carry out nullification, and they didn't invent the idea either. But the principles they espoused are timeless. Going to the federal government to fix problems created by the federal government doesn't work. Did you know the federal government works with local police to create a huge loophole in any state restrictions on asset forfeiture? Understanding what's happening is the first step to ending it. Civil asset forfeiture is what law enforcement uses to seize and sell property that they assert has been involved in a criminal activity. These proceedings essentially charge the property with involvement in a crime, and police can take your money and even sell your car, your home, or other valuables without ever having to even charge you with a crime. There has been increasing public attention on these programs, and calls to reform them on a state level usually include a requirement for criminal conviction before prosecutors can proceed with forfeiture. Some states have also proposed depositing proceeds into the general fund instead of allowing police departments to keep the money. That supposedly removes the incentive to concentrate on forfeiture instead of actual crime fighting. But these actions mean nothing unless they close a loophole allowing state and local police to simply pass forfeiture cases to the feds and take your property anyway. Here's how it works. Let's say police pull over a car and find $10,000 cash. They don't find drugs, but suspect it's drug-related, so they take it. If state law is good on forfeiture, police can't keep the money without an actual conviction. So instead, what they do is simply claim the case is a federal issue, allowing them to hand it off to a federal agency. This opens the door to a program known as the Federal Equitable Sharing Program, and the police then get to keep as much as 80% of the forfeiture, with only about 20% going to the federal agency. In places like California, this has become common practice to get around strong restrictions on asset forfeiture at the state level. New Mexico, however, took the first step in April of 2015 with a new law that closes this loophole for a vast majority of cases. While legislation to reform forfeiture in states like Wyoming, Oklahoma, Arizona, and elsewhere bring important attention to legalized government theft, they'll have no long-term real effect unless this massive federal loophole is closed by each state.